Okay, I think we will go ahead and start. Welcome, everybody. I'm Sharon Reed. I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the Museum of Art. And I would like to welcome you to our Spotlight on Public Art at Dartmouth virtual series, in which we look at public art around campus. These are archived on our YouTube channel, so you will find them there. Today, we're pleased to bring you Peaceful Serenity by Allan C. Houser. And before I turn it over to my colleague and today's guest, I just wanted to say that I will send the link around for the YouTube channel following the program. This is about a 30-minute program. It's short. We'll have an introduction to the sculpture, a discussion with our special guest, and there will be some time at the end for questions. So please don't be shy. Pop them into the Q&A at any time so you don't forget what you want to ask. And we are running live subtitles today. If you wish to turn those off, I will put instructions in the chat on how to turn those off. And now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Jami Powell, Curator of Indigenous Art. Jami?
Thank you, Sharon. I'd like to begin with acknowledging the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki peoples. Today, however, our guest and I are joining you from the Allan Houser Gallery, which is located on the traditional lands of the Tewa people on what is known as Ogapoge Owinge, the White Shell Water Place, or Santa Fe, New Mexico. Surrounding us are the landscapes of the Pueblo, Apache, and Navajo nations, whose people continue to maintain vital connections to this place. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place and provides a crucial foundation for building respectful relationship with all those who call these lands home today and into the future. I would also like to thank the Hood staff who helped make this program possible, including the always amazing Sharon Reed and Allison Palazzolo and Ale Geisel Zamora for helping gather images. Today, I'm so excited to be joining you live from the Allan Houser Gallery, along with the Curator of Corporate Collections for Allan Houser Incorporated, David Rettig. David is a Dartmouth graduate from the class of 1975, and during his time at Dartmouth, had the opportunity to get involved with Native American art. Let me switch the slide here. Through the Studio Art Department's Artist in Residence program. I'm going to ask him to tell you about that in a moment, but first I want to express how grateful I am to have David as part of the Hood and Dartmouth family. He is so knowledgeable and generous with his time. In fact, just a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to spend the day with David, as well as our former intern and curatorial fellows at the Allan Houser Sculpture Garden and Archives, now known as House's Place. So when we started planning for this Spotlight on Public Art event highlighting Peaceful Serenity, I knew David had to be involved. So David, before we get started talking about Peaceful Serenity, could I ask you to share with folks your abridged version, potentially, of how you connected with Allan Houser and how you worked with him over the years?
Yes, I'm a proud graduate of Dartmouth College. I was class of 75, although I took 1 year off and didn't actually graduate until 1976, which was fortuitous because in the summer of 1975, T.C. Cannon came as the artist in residence at Dartmouth College. And as a department assistant, I was asked to help him find supplies and various projects. And he and I actually became very good friends during that period. So a year later, when I graduated and was trying to figure out where to live, TC said, well, why don't you come to Santa Fe? And it was a great place to start an artist career. So I arrived in Santa Fe in July of 1976. And TC had an opening at the Wheelwright Museum in Santa Fe, and we went to that the Sunday afternoon. He said, some other friends of mine are having a show downtown. So we drove downtown to the Santa Fe Plaza and walked over to this small gallery. And just inside the door of the gallery was an older gentleman, and TC told me, oh, Dave, that's Allan. You have to meet Allan. This is Allan Houser. He's the most famous Indian artist ever, and without him, most of us wouldn't be artists, because Allan was his teacher and mentor, as well as thousands of other artists. So that was my first meeting with Allan, and one thing led to another, and I knew him for 20 years up until his passing then in 1994.
Thank you for sharing. And if any of you ever have the opportunity to come to Santa Fe and to come visit the Allan Houser Gallery or see the sculpture garden at House's Place, David is an incredible tour guide, and it is the highlight of my trip to Santa Fe every year. So on to Peaceful Serenity. Centered between Sherman House, home of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Department, as well as the Native American House, Peaceful Serenity is a work of art that is beloved by the Dartmouth community and Indigenous students and faculty in particular. I know my family and I enjoy having lots of picnics on the table nearby, and I often think of these figures as part of a family, or when I'm missing home, I can kind of go visit with them and be reminded of the connection that I have with my own mother. And I know I've heard other students or other folks and students in particular talk about that. Within this figure, the simple curved forms of the mother and child exemplify Houser's masterful use of form, line, as well as negative space. David, can you talk about Houser's figurative works and the development of his modernist or abstracted style that we see within the sculpture?
Well, Allan started as a painting student in 1934 at the Santa Fe Indian School. And he worked primarily in Apache imagery for a number of years, but eventually he started integrating more maternal themes into his paintings, and then later into his sculptural work. His principal medium that he started out with in sculpture was marble and stone. His first piece was done in 1948 as a commission for the Haskell School in Lawrence, Kansas, commemorating all of the Native soldiers who served and died in World War II. And as his sculpture work evolved here in Santa Fe during the 1960s, he did do a lot of maternal themes, that is, mothers and mother and child, mother and children, and they make up a significant proportion of his overall genre. In 1989, he was inspired to undertake more geometric forms, which he created in sheet metal. And these, rather than being cast bronze or carved in any manner, they're actually cut from flat patterns in a thin bronze plate, and then they're curved and welded back together and then meticulously finished. Between 1989 and 1994, he created about 25 different editions done in this fabricated bond. Peaceful Serenity is one of the premier examples of that. It is this smooth, perfect form, and one would hardly guess that it was actually pattern cut, like a clothing pattern or a furniture pattern, from flat bronze sheet metal and then welded back together. But he's using it in a very abstracted, spirit-like form to create this piece, which shows, again, that central family theme.
One of the things that I really appreciate about Houser's work, in addition to the mastery of skill, as you mentioned, is the way that by kind of creating these simplified forms, he's actually able to speak to more complexity and multiplicity, which seems counterintuitive. But I feel like you can connect to these works more because of the absence of facial features or other things. There's something kind of universal about these figures.
No, exactly. And some of my very favorite pieces of Allan's are these spirit-like presences. There's one called "This Was Our Home," which is again of a mother and a child that invoke the thought or the presence that these people, they're faceless, and their forms are very beautifully defined, but they evoke the thought that these people were here for generations and generations in the past, and that their spirit and their presence is still here.
Now that you're saying that, I'm also seeing how these, not only is there a timeless quality to them, but they, will resonate far into the future because of this abstraction as well. So thinking about the kind of modernist aesthetic that Houser developed, in his time, he was really kind of pushing against these expectations of Indigenous artists to create things based on their communities and things that were considered to be appropriate themes for Native artists to depict in their work. And so, people often talk about Houser as, a seminal figure within Native American modernism and abstraction. But I think we would both argue that he's a seminal figure in American abstraction. Can you talk a little bit about, how he came to rely on these kind of the line and negative space and form to kind of push back against these expectations?
Yeah, he was always trying to take fee of the stereotypes. His early training was with Dorothy Dunn here in Santa Fe, at the Santa Fe Indian School. And he really was required in that to create these kind of quintessential images, what people think of Native American paintings from that period of the 1930s and 40s. But then as he evolved his own style and works later on, he started experimenting. I know there's a wonderful painting. He was commissioned to do murals at the Department of Interior building in 1938 and 1939. 1940, he made two paintings, which I have hanging in our archives. One is very much a study of the style of the murals in the Department of Interior headquarters. The other is a piece called Apache Kid. And with that painting, he actually is kind of an autobiographical portrait. He took a cabinet card of the famous mythological, well, he was a real figure, the Apache Kid, but he painted it such that he was the Apache Kid. And it was groundbreaking because it was totally outside of this Dorothy Dunn style, out of the studio style. And then as he went forward, he really developed his own sculptural work and his own sculptural style. He didn't have a mentor, so it allowed him to experiment. And he liked to look at works in particular of some of the European modernists of art, Lipschitz, and then later Henry Moore and Lisa Managuchi and Barbara Hepworth. And he drew inspiration from their simplified abstracted forms. And his own style evolved such that, people will come in our gallery here sometimes and say, oh, how many artists do you represent? And I'll say, no, it's just all one artist. It's a 60-year evolution of his style and work. In the last 5 years, and we're seeing an image here of a piece titled Options, which is one of these 25 different editions that he created in sheet metal. And this one, there are two like-shaped objects. They're not symmetric, but they're like-shaped. And they're placed together, but they can be tumbled onto corners and edges and flat surfaces. And that's where the title comes from, because from these two objects, you can create hundreds of different options, as it's called, and different sculptural work. So he was always experimenting. He gifted one of these abstract pieces to the Institute of American Indian Arts Museum here in Santa Fe, and he taught there for 13 years, his final teaching position. And I was at the opening ceremony in 1993, and it was shrouded with with a canopy, with a sheet, and he gave a very minimalist discussion as he usually did. And they pulled the sheet off, and there was this gasp from the crowd because it was this purely abstract form. It's called cereos. And he paused and he said, well, Yeah, a lot of you are probably expecting something different from me, something more traditional, but I'm always experimenting, I'm always changing, I'm always evolving. And that was his statement to the people and his statement to posterity, I think.
Yeah, so we can talk about this one, but as we're going through these images, for our audience, some of the images that you're seeing that are not Peaceful Serenity are from an exhibition that the Hood Museum did in celebration of the centennial of Allan Houser. So there was an installation of several sculptural works around the museum and BVAC to celebrate Houser's work. A lot of these works, I'm noticing though, David, were created in 1992. And 1992 was kind of a big year for Native art because it marked the kind of quincentennial or the 500th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And there were a lot of museums and institutions that were, wanting to work with Native artists, maybe who hadn't before, because in celebration of this anniversary. I'm curious, do you know how Allan felt about the kind of that 500th anniversary, or why this year was particularly prolific?
I don't remember us ever having a specific dialogue about the significance of that date. I know the one thing which happened was the Smithsonian had an exhibition in Washington, D.C., actually at the castle of an exhibition called Shared Visions, which Allan and his son Bob Houses, who also was an artist in residence, they both had pieces in the show. And that was supposed to be at the opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. But for pragmatic reasons, land reasons, political reasons, the National Museum of the American Indian didn't open until 2004. And so it was 12 years late, but I know around that, he went to Washington for the opening of that Shared Vision show at the Smithsonian. So I know there was a focus, that he had a focus on those dates as well. The piece that's on the slide here has a wonderful bit of continuity, because in his paintings, starting in 1934, he did a lot of the Apache Mountain Spirit dancer figure. Dorothy Dunn at the painting class, she had a rule that they had to work in tribal specific imagery. So he did Apache images. Among those were many images of the Apache Mountain Spirit dancer, gun dancer. They're also called crown dancers or fire dancers, because the dance is traditionally performed around a fire. And so what were originally these very kind of static, well, they weren't static, but they're these linear, high contrast images of these paintings. They evolved into about 20 different sculptural works. And with those sculptural works, he would again experiment with different styles as he did. This one is called the Abstract Crown Dancer 1, and it was done in 1992. And it's a sheet metal fabrication. In this piece, there are 157 separate pieces of bronze plate that are cut out, bent, and then welded together. It takes a fabricator about 9 months to put one of these together. And they're quite spectacular. And this is wonderful in front of the Black Family Arts Center there at the exhibition in 2014.
So I'd like to transition now to questions that the audience may have about Peaceful Serenity, about Allan Houser, and anything really about Native art in general. But to get us started, in addition to his legacy, of the students or of the sculptures that he has, in public art installations throughout the country, including many state capitals, the in Washington, D.C. He also had this other legacy that you referenced earlier through the thousands of students he taught during his 13 years while he was at IAIA. Can you talk a little bit about his legacy and the ways that people in the Native art world think about Allan as this seminal figure in multiple ways?
Well, he was a wonderful teacher. He actually taught for 11 years at the Intermountain School in Brigham City, Utah in the 1950s, where all of his students were Navajo students. And some of those students will come and comment on it. And, but I think the way he wasn't a dogmatic teacher. He didn't say, well, you have to do it this way and you have to do it that way and you have to carve this way. He often, until he was forbidden to work in the IAIA classrooms, he used to like to work alongside his students and watch them work and have them watch him work as an example. And he encouraged them to be their own person. He encouraged them to find their own voice. One of his students came to him one day with this perfect recreation of one of his stone carvings, and asked him, "Well, Allan, what do you think of this?" And Allan said, "Well, anybody can copy. You need to find your own voice." And he was very encouraging. He was a very calm, quiet person. When he spoke very simply, but very profoundly. And through the years, I've met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of his students, and I've never had any of them utter a bad word. They all have this deep respect for him as a mentor and a teacher, and his work ethic. His work ethic of working every day and trying to do something new every day.
So it looks like we have a couple of questions that came in. One is, was he familiar with Henry Moore?
Very much so. Henry Moore was his favorite contemporary. They were almost exactly the same age. And he became familiar with him probably back in the 60s or 70s. And he followed Henry Moore's work very intently. And there are a number of pieces that Allan created that you'll see the aesthetic resonance. You'll see the aesthetic interpretation of Henry Moore. He actually had an appointment, which I helped make, to go meet Henry Moore in Leeds. He had his tickets purchased and he was looking so much forward to it. But sadly, Mr. Moore passed away about a month before he was going to make the trip. But he admired Henry Moore above all other artists.
So another question is, how was Allan Houser's work received outside of the US?
Well, he had a number of shows which traveled particularly in Germany and through the close parts of Eastern Europe, and so probably in any of the countries in the world that he had the most acceptance. In Germany, he has some pieces there, but he also was followed by, and he has a piece in the Japanese Royal Collection, which the Clintons gave Emperor Akihito on his first state visit in 1994. So he is known throughout the world. That's one of the things we kind of try to do, promote, is and give him exposure to a broader audience. I think the one thing that made it difficult for Allan while he was alive, and one thing that still resonates, is among institutions in particular, there's this institutional racism that exists. I remember we had a presentation to the curator at the Chicago Art Institute about 15 years ago, and there were a number of collectors that wanted to give major pieces to the Chicago Art Institute. We met with the curator, And he says, oh yeah, this is very fine. It's, you know, it's great work and everything, but we really don't have very much room in our Indian collection. And he took us downstairs to this dusty room in the basement filled with pottery and baskets and very insulting, you know. And for many, many years, Allan's work, as much as it was a mainstream of 20th century modernism, was viewed on by curators both in the States and through Europe as being just Indian art and nothing beyond Indian art. So, but he is known in Europe, but we have 80 different museums here in the United States that have major examples of work in their collections.
Yeah, it's, you know, I think that kind of institutional racism and the idea that, you know, Native art can only belong within very particular areas or collections within museums is something that we certainly don't subscribe to at the Hood Museum. And one of the things that brought me to the Hood, but it's still a conversation that I think a lot of institutions are grappling with. And I think that, you know, this kind of conversation that's emerging about recognizing, you know, the role that Indigenous aesthetics have played within, you know, modernism is a really fruitful area for research. Can you just give us a brief overview about the archives that you have?
Yes, we have at where Allan built his final studio in, well, he built this big sculpture studio in 1982, and then in 1990, he created an indoor space that he used as his design studio, and then one room he committed solely to creating large pastel and charcoal drawings, which he made about 200 of those in the final 4 years that he was alive. And he built this gallery space, which he was planning on using once his contract expired in 1994. But sadly, that's when he fell ill and passed away. So this gallery space is a big vaulted room with track lighting. And shortly after his death, almost everything from his design studio, everything that could be moved from his big sculpture studio, and then Mrs. Houser started bringing things from their residence, was put in this archives room. And they had a full-time archivist who worked there for 10 years, starting to catalog everything. We have about 3,000 objects in there, and that doesn't include the 1,600 matted drawings, and we have 233 sketchbooks, which date back to the 1950s. And many of the sketchbooks will have, 6, 8, 10 sketches per page, and I estimate there are about 30,000 thumbnail sketches in these sketchbooks. So it's quite a voluminous archive, and we open it to scholars like Jami and some of her associates and previous associates from the Hood. And once a year, we open it up to the public, which is going to be this coming weekend, where we allow people not to rifle through things, but to come in and at a distance look around and see this incredible collection.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, especially during an incredibly busy week. For those of you who are joining us who don't know, this is the annual SWAIA art market. And so it's one of the busiest weeks of the year for David and his team, but also in Santa Fe. So we're so grateful that you took the time to share with us. And
I'm jurying sculpture at market tomorrow morning tomorrow during the day for about 6 hours. So.
Well, we look forward to future events with you. We didn't even cover drawings, and so I see a future program where we just dig into the drawings.
Yeah, the Hood has some drawings in the collection that they acquired during that 2014 exhibition.
Yeah, so, and in fact, some of our interns, Dylan Peace, who you met, and Shondine Brown, have an upcoming exhibition that will be opening in 2022 that has some of Allan's drawings in it. So maybe we can do something then. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, Sharon, as always, for making all of this possible.
Thank you, Jamie and David. Have a great afternoon, everybody.